Hi students, this is Deanna and I am here with your very, very brief history of scenic design. The point of this video is to give a brief, very quick overview of scenic design through the ages and to give you a few famous scenic designers whose names you can learn, who you should know about. So this begins, as many theater historical trips through time begin, with the Greeks. The Greeks were early practitioners of theater, though not the first practitioners of theater. The first practitioners of theater were very likely in Africa. The Greeks, of course, are very much studied by theater historians of all types, and in fact our word theater comes from a Greek word, theatron, which means seeing place. The Greeks may not have made much attempt, depending upon who you ask and what sources you consult, they may not have made much attempt to do much to distinguish the seeing place, that is, the theater itself, from the setting of the play. It may be that the Greeks just went to the theater to see a play be performed, and that's where they were, was in a theater. They may not have been much in the way of scenery. Next, we're going to skip forward to the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, most of what was performed theatrically was passion plays or pageants. And in many places in Europe, these were separate wagons or stations that were decorated very symbolically. So, for example, if you wanted a place to represent hell, which is the place of eternal torment, it might literally involve lots of fire and sulfur and sort of torturous looking things. So the symbolism in the Middle Ages becomes the literal reality of the setting, and the audience wanders from place to place, and each place has its own literal placeness or location. Then later on in the Elizabethan age, the age of Shakespeare, we know for a fact that Shakespeare used very few pieces of scenery, very few props. The audience sat on all sides of the stage. Sometimes they even sat on stage for an extra premium. It was extra expensive to sit on the stage. And the detail about where the location of this or the setting is comes from vivid descriptions in the language. For example, Macbeth in the Scottish play says to the witches, "Upon this blasted heath you stop our way." And so the audience knows, where are we? Well, we're on a blasted heath because Macbeth just said so. All of this starts to change with the invention of the proscenium stage, with the classic picture frame opening that separates the audience from what's happening on the stage. There are lots of different theories about where the proscenium stage comes from, but wherever it came from, it did two things for sure. It unified the audience view and put the audience all out front so that they were all looking at the stage from one angle, and it put an emphasis on Aristotle's final element of theater, spectacle, or what is seen. There were many different mechanical solutions for moving scenery around a proscenium stage that were developed, including one that you may have heard of in your theater history classes called pole and chariot method for moving scenery around, and also the fly system and fly loft that we still use today. Not in Lefevre, of course, but in many, many modern theaters it's still used. But all of these methods for moving scenery around were based on flat painted scenery. These were feats of what is called in French, and please excuse my accent, trompe-l'oeil, which means to fool the eye. Trompe-l'oeil painting is something that looks incredibly realistic, and that's what these flat painted scenery backdrops were. They looked amazing, but they really only looked amazing from one spot. And, of course, most importantly, the actors couldn't interact with them. Look at this backdrop. And what we have all the way upstage, right upstage center, painted flat stairs that no one can ever climb. No entrance can ever be made there. They just look pretty. Then, in the middle of the 19th century, we have the invention of photography. And that begins to change everything, because the question of what it means to depict something begins to change based on this new discovery. So, in the visual art world, artists like Pablo Picasso start painting artworks that point out and comment on the flatness of a painted image. So here is a painting by Pablo Picasso that can be read as a building and some trees and a hillside, but it also can very easily be read as just flat painted shapes on a canvas, which of course is exactly what they are. And in the theater world, people react to the invention of photography in two very different ways. One way was to go with total realism and the birth of the movement called naturalism. And that begins with people like in this production of Miss Julie by August Strindberg. That involves people recreating as accurately and completely realistically as possible on stage entire rooms, and the actors inhabiting them in a completely realistic, naturalistic way. More on that later. The other way that the theater world begins to react to the invention of photography has a lot to do with this gentleman, Adolf Appia. He is the author of your reading for your homework that you're going to be doing after you watch this video. He was a Swiss architect and scenic designer, and his work was all about acknowledging the stage as three-dimensional space. Look at some of the sketches for his set designs. They were like nothing you've ever seen before. Now, these are not intended to be backdrops. These are intended to be sketches of what the scenery would look like. It was dimensional, with the ability for actors to move from upstage to downstage, with stairs and levels. Appia wrote extensively about the importance of the actor moving through space, and that's what I want you to pay attention to when you read his work for homework later. Appia's writing and Appia's theories give way to a tradition of design in Europe that is known as scenography. It's a little bit different from our American tradition of scenic design. Traditionally, scenographers have control over the entire stage picture, scenery, lighting, and costumes. They design them all. And they're also much more deeply involved with audience perception and storytelling. How does the audience perceive this story? How do they read this part of the story? One famous example of a European scenographer is Joseph Svoboda. His work is very conceptual. Look at his design for Oedipus Rex. You may remember that in Oedipus Rex, Aristotle talks about the fall from grace. And his work, his scenic design for Oedipus Rex, really embodies and typifies the entire idea, the concept of a fall. It's highly conceptual work. Here in the United States, on the other hand, our design traditions were influenced by the idea of realism and the idea of realism in acting that, as you know, we've been very influenced by the idea of Stanislavski's acting techniques. And the design work that's been famous or well known here in the States has also been strongly linked with realism. It's been linked very strongly with architectural statements, and it's very literal. So here is one example by a very famous American designer named Joe Melziner. He was most active in the middle of the 20th century. This is his famous design for Death of a Salesman. And you can see that although it is a slightly abstracted, slightly poetic version of a house, it is strongly based on the architectural details that you would see in an American bungalow in the 1950s. And while American design work is still very, very influenced by architectural realism and by the work of Melziner, it is also starting to change. And in large part, that is due to the work of this man, Ming-Cho Lee. He is an incredibly influential designer. He is still living. He introduced a greater level of abstraction to American set designs. Here, for example, is his design for the play Electra. And as you can see, it's based much less on architectural detail than it is on an imaginative space. In addition to his very important scenic design work, Lee also taught at Yale University for over 40 years, and in doing so, he trained an entire generation of American designers. So there you have my very brief and highly simplified history of scenic design, along with the names of 4 scenic designers that you should know: Appia, Svoboda, Melziner, and Lee.